They thought she was just a woman with a dog. That was their first mistake. It wouldn't be their last. The trail outside Whistler cuts through dense Douglas fir and Sitka spruce, winding along the edge of a ridge where the Cheakamus River runs cold and fast 300 meters below. In October, most of the summer hikers are gone. The mountain bikers have packed up. What's left is quiet. The kind of quiet that belongs to people who know how to move through wilderness without announcing themselves. Corporal Sable Merritt knew that kind of quiet. She had lived inside it for the better part of 8 years. She was 31 years old, and had spent the last 4 of those years assigned to the Canadian Forces Military Working Dog Program out of CFB Valcartier, before a shrapnel injury to her left forearm pulled her off active rotation. The injury had healed. The paperwork said so, but the forces moved slowly, and while she waited for reinstatement, she had come to Whistler because her cousin had a cabin and because Harko needed the elevation. Harko was her Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, 72 pounds, and possessed of the kind of quiet intelligence that made most people uncomfortable. He had a scar running from his left shoulder to his mid-chest, where a fragment of IED casing had caught him in Kandahar province. He didn't seem to remember it, or if he did, he had filed it somewhere that didn't trouble him. Sable envied him that. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning. The trail was empty, which was why she'd chosen it. She wasn't in the mood to answer questions about the dog, or explain his working collar, or smile at strangers' children who reached out to touch him without asking. Harko walked at her left knee without a command, his ears tracking independently the way they always did, cataloguing sounds she couldn't hear. His breathing was steady. His tail moved in that low, controlled sweep that meant he was relaxed but paying attention. He was always paying attention. She heard the truck before she saw it. A mud-caked GMC Sierra with no front plate had nosed onto the forestry access road that intersected the trail about 400 meters ahead. 3 men climbed out. Even at distance, the way they moved didn't read right. Too deliberate, too aware of the sight lines. One of them scanned the tree line before he shut the truck door, which was the kind of thing you only did if you were expecting someone or hiding something. Sable slowed her pace without stopping. Her hand didn't move toward anything. She just watched. Harko's ears went flat and forward. Not aggression. Assessment. He had a hierarchy of signals she'd learned to read like weather. Ears flat and forward meant he was cataloging. Ears back meant he'd already decided. Right now he was still deciding. The 3 men walked to the center of the trail and waited. Not walked past, not continued on their way. Waited. For her. She kept her pace even and crossed the last 100 meters without hurrying. There was a geometry to encounters like this. If you ran, you confirmed something. If you changed direction, you confirmed something else. She had been taught, and then she had taught others, that the safest thing was almost always to continue on a straight line and let the other party make the first declaration. The tallest one, heavy across the shoulders, a plaid jacket that had seen better decades, a jaw like poured concrete, spread his arms slightly when she was 20 meters out. The universal gesture for stop right there. She stopped. Trails closed, he said. His name, she would learn later, was Kevin Drost. He was 44 years old and had 3 prior convictions in BC, 2 for aggravated assault, 1 for possession for the purpose of trafficking. He ran supply for a network operating between Pemberton and Squamish, using forestry roads that the RCMP didn't patrol regularly enough. He had a particular talent for identifying people who looked like they wouldn't cause problems. He was looking at Sable now. "I don't see a sign," she said. The one to his left, younger, maybe late 20s, wearing a vest over a long-sleeve thermal, a toothpick working the left corner of his mouth, smiled like she'd said something funny. He had close-cropped hair and the kind of flat, patient eyes that sometimes meant discipline and sometimes meant vacancy. His name was Bryce Faulkner. He'd been with Drost for 3 years. The third man hung back near the tree line. He was smaller, nervous in the way that came from too much coffee, or too little sleep. He kept his hands visible, which Sable noted as significant. Men who were not nervous didn't think about where their hands were. "Don't need a sign," Drost said. "We're telling you. Trail's closed." Harko made no sound. He sat. She hadn't told him to sit. He'd done it on his own, the way he did when he was conserving energy for something he'd already decided was coming. He was watching Faulkner specifically. Harko was good at reading where the action would initiate. He'd always been better at that than she was. "I'm just taking my dog for a walk," Sable said. "I'll be through in 2 minutes." Drost looked at Harko. Something crossed his face. Contempt, maybe, or just the reflex of a man who had never been challenged by anything he couldn't outweigh. "Nice animal," he said, and his tone made it clear he didn't mean it as a compliment. "He is," she said. "Looks expensive." She didn't answer that. Drost took a step closer. Not all the way, just enough to test whether she'd move back. She didn't. "You know what those dogs go for," he said. "A trained one like that. Certain buyers up north, they pay well." Harko stood up. It wasn't a dramatic movement. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply went from sitting to standing, and every muscle in his body reorganized itself with the quiet efficiency of something that had been trained to wait, and then trained to move without warning. His eyes were on Drost. Something shifted in the air. Faulkner stopped smiling. The third man took a half step back. Sable's voice, when she spoke, was very calm. "I'm going to say this once. Move away from the trail, get back in your truck, and we're all going to have a good day." She paused. "That's the only version of this that ends well for you." Drost laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound that she recognized. She had heard it from men who'd underestimated things before, usually right before the thing demonstrated why they shouldn't have. "You alone out here," he said. "No one around for, 3 kilometers? "Further than that," she said, and there was no fear in her voice, which seemed to confuse him briefly. "Then here's what's going to happen," Drost said. "You're going to leave that dog, and you're going to walk back the way you came, and nobody gets hurt." Harko's ears went back. He hadn't done that for anything in 2 years. Not since Kandahar. Sable felt something settle in her chest. It wasn't adrenaline. She'd had enough adrenaline in her life to know the difference between that and something older, colder, and considerably more efficient. This was the feeling she got when the calculation had been completed, and the variables were no longer variables, when the situation had stopped being a situation and become a sequence. "Last chance," she said quietly. Faulkner moved first. He came from her left, reaching for Harko's collar, which was the decision that ended any remaining version of this in which nobody got hurt. She said one word, "Fass." Harko was already in motion before the second syllable. He hit Faulkner at mid-chest with 72 pounds of committed Malinois and drove him back and down into the gravel in a single economical motion. There was no excessive fury, no wasted energy, just the precise, trained application of force to the point of control. Faulkner went down hard. Harko pinned the wrist of his reaching arm, not breaking, just holding, with the particular authority of a dog that had been trained by people who understood the difference between stopping a threat and destroying one. Sable was already moving toward Drost. He swung, a wide, telegraphed right hand that told her everything about his fighting background, which was brawls outside bars and maybe some backyard wrestling and no formal training whatsoever. She slipped it at the shoulder, and in the space that opened up, she drove her elbow into his jaw, not with the dramatic overhead arc of action sequences, but with the short, brutal geometry of a close-quarters strike designed by people who'd fought in corridors. His head snapped sideways. He staggered. She didn't stop. She put her hip through him, got the outside of his ankle, and he went down. The third man had his phone out. "Put it away," she said, and something in her voice made him put it in his pocket without deciding to. People had asked her later what that quality was in her voice when she used it like that, and she'd never found a way to explain it. It wasn't volume. It was something about certainty, the particular register of a person to whom violence has become sufficiently familiar that they no longer need to perform it in advance. She had her knee on Drost's back. She had zip ties in the left pocket of her trail vest. She'd carried them since her second deployment, and had never fully broken the habit. She secured his wrists behind him. He was breathing hard but conscious. Good. She preferred conscious. Harko, aus. He released Faulkner's wrist and stepped back 2 paces and sat, his breathing barely elevated, watching her with the calm attentiveness of a professional who had completed his portion of the task and was now waiting for further instruction. The scar on his chest caught the October light. Faulkner was on his back in the gravel, cradling his wrist, staring up at the tree line with the expression of a man whose model of the world had just been revised in a direction he hadn't anticipated. "Don't," she told him, and he didn't. She patted Drost down efficiently. No sidearm, which surprised her slightly, but there was a hunting knife in his boot and a burner phone in his jacket pocket. Faulkner had a folding knife and, more significantly, a folded piece of paper with what appeared to be coordinates and a time written on it. She read the time. 40 minutes from now. The third man's name, she learned because it was printed on a work order crumpled in his vest pocket, was T. Hendricks. He was a local. He had a legitimate forestry job and was apparently using his access codes to open the gate on the service road. He sat on a stump with his head in his hands and didn't look up. She called it in on her cell, the RCMP detachment at Whistler. Then she called a number that had a 613 area code, which is Ottawa, and she said 6 words. She said, "Possible supply route Cheakamus corridor, Tuesday." The person on the other end asked 2 questions. She answered both. The call lasted 40 seconds. She sat on a boulder with Harko leaning against her left leg, and the 3 men secured or subdued nearby, and she watched the trail and the tree line, and listened to the river in the valley below and waited. Harko put his chin on her thigh. She rested her hand on his head, between his ears, in the spot he'd always liked. "Good boy," she said quietly, which was a significant understatement. But Harko seemed to take it in the spirit intended. The first RCMP vehicle came up the service road 18 minutes later. Constable Derek Mounts, young, competent, clearly doing the math on the scene as he stepped out of the cruiser, looked at Drost zip-tied in the gravel, looked at Faulkner, looked at Hendricks on his stump, looked at Sable on her boulder with the Malinois on her leg, and said, "Ma'am, can you walk me through what happened here?" She did. She kept it factual and chronological, which was how she'd been trained to report. She mentioned the coordinates and the time on the paper from Faulkner's pocket. Mounts got on his radio. Within 10 minutes there were 2 more units and a request in to the integrated drug team operating out of Squash. A woman in civilian clothes arrived with the second wave, dark jacket, no insignia, the kind of comfortable shoes you wore when you might need to move quickly. She introduced herself as Inspector Carver. She shook Sable's hand, looked at the paper with the coordinates and said, "We've been trying to locate this drop point for 11 weeks. "It's 40 minutes out," Sable said. "Was 40 minutes out. 20 now." Inspector Carver nodded once and walked back to make a call. 12 minutes later, 3 vehicles were heading up the Cheakamus forestry road toward a set of coordinates where, as it turned out, a transfer of $700,000 worth of fentanyl was scheduled to take place in a clearing by the river, under a tarp in 4 waterproofed containers that had been there since the previous Thursday. Sable watched the vehicles go. She scratched Harko behind his right ear. He made a small sound that was not quite a groan and not quite a sigh, which was his general commentary on situations that had resolved in a satisfactory direction. Mounts came back over. "You were out here for a walk," he said. "It wasn't quite a question." "I was out here for a walk," she confirmed. "With a military working dog. He's on medical leave. Same as me." Mounts looked at Harko. Harko looked back at him with the same level, unreadable expression he brought to everything. "What branch?" Mounts asked. "Canadian Forces," she said. Military Working Dog Program. He the one who took down Faulkner. We both contributed. Mounts looked at the marks in the gravel where Faulkner had hit the ground, and then at Faulkner himself, who was now sitting in the back of a cruiser looking at his shoes. Yeah, Mounts said. I see that. Inspector Carver came back. She stood in front of Sable with her hands in her jacket pockets and regarded her for a moment. We're going to need a full statement, she said, and there's a debrief we'd like you to sit in on if you're willing. The integrated team has questions about the route. I can do that, Sable said. The dog too? Sable looked down at Harko. He was watching a raven that had appeared in the spruce above them, his ears tracking it with professional interest. He goes where I go, she said. Carver almost smiled. I figured. She turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. Drost is talking. Started as soon as the second unit arrived. He's trying to make a deal. He says there are 2 more drop points on this corridor. Different days, different products. How many people know about those points? Right now, just him. And you. Carver looked at her steadily. We'd appreciate it if you stayed available. I'm on medical leave, Sable said. I've got nowhere to be. She watched the inspector walk back toward the cluster of vehicles. The forest had filled up with people and radios, and the crackle of procedure, which was a thing she had spent years of her life inside, and which still felt, at its edges, like a kind of controlled chaos that she both understood and didn't quite belong to anymore. She wasn't sure where she belonged. She was working on that. Harko pushed his nose against her hand. She looked down at him. He looked up at her, and in his dark eyes there was nothing complicated. No ambivalence, no question of belonging. He was here. She was here. The work had been done well. Everything else was secondary. She closed her fingers around his ear gently. Okay, she said, mostly to herself. Okay, the raven called once from the spruce, and then lifted off dark and certain against the pale October sky, and was gone.